Light is patient. It leaves a star and crosses the dark for years, sometimes for centuries, and arrives at a pair of open eyes long after the star itself has shifted, or dimmed, or burned all the way down to something else entirely. A man can stand under that light every night of his life and never once ask what he is actually looking at, an old signal sent by something that may no longer exist in the shape it once had. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. Corwin Vale understood this better than almost anyone in 3 counties. His own family understood it not at all, and on a cold Thursday morning in November of 2025, in a narrow law office above the hardware store on Main Street in Larkins Notch, North Carolina, that failure of understanding came due like a debt nobody had bothered to read the terms of. Renata Vale sat in the last chair against the wall, not at the table, because the table had 3 seats and her husband's brother and sister had taken 2 of them before she'd even hung up her coat. She was 39 years old that November, and she had worn the same charcoal dress to this office that she had worn to Desmond's funeral 5 years before, because it was still the only dress she owned that did not have a hospital smell folded into the seams. Her son Milo, 12, sat beside her with his hands folded in his lap the way she had taught him to sit in rooms where grown men were about to decide things. He did not know yet what was being decided. Neither, really, did she. Attorney Nathaniel Corrigan had practiced law in Larkins Notch for 34 years, long enough to have drafted half the wills in the county and buried a fair portion of his own clients himself at the little Methodist church down the hill where he served as an usher on Sundays. He had a gray mustache he was forever smoothing with one knuckle, and a habit of reading slowly, the way a man reads when he already knows a sentence is going to land wrong on somebody in the room and wants to give them the courtesy of hearing every word of it clearly. He read the house first. The old Vale place on Cutter's Run, for bedrooms, a wraparound porch, the workshop out back where Corwin had once ground his own mirrors by hand. To Weston. He read the accounts next, the brokerage portfolio, the shares in Fenwick Precision Optics that Corwin had held on to since the sale of his patents in the 70s, the 2 trucks, and the sedan. To Weston, all of it, because Weston had gone into the optics business himself, had grown Fenwick's regional distribution arm into something with his name on the door, and had spent the last decade telling anyone who would listen that he was the son who understood what their father had actually built. He read the jewelry next, Miriam Vale's wedding set, her sapphire brooch, a small but respectable stock portfolio Corwin had kept separate for exactly this purpose. To Priscilla, who sat very straight in her chair in a cream wool coat that had never seen a Larkins Notch winter up close, and who nodded at each item the way a woman nods at a menu she has already decided on. Then Corrigan turned a page and paused, the particular pause of a man who has read a sentence in private a dozen times and still isn't sure how it will sound out loud in front of the people it concerns. To my daughter-in-law, Renata Vale, he read, I leave the Observatory Dome and the surrounding 41 acres on Halcyon Ridge, known locally as the Vale Observatory, together with all its fixtures and contents. Assessed tax value, $1. The room went the particular kind of still that follows a number nobody expected. Weston Vale, 61 years old, built like a man who had spent 3 decades in boardrooms and knew it, let out a short breath through his nose that was not quite a laugh, and was not quite anything else either. The tower, he said. He left her the tower. That's what the will states, Corrigan said, not looking up. Well, Weston sat back. He had a way of settling into a chair that made the chair feel smaller. Keep it. Then, run, if the stars mean that much to you. Lord knows none of the rest of us were ever going to climb up there. Priscilla, 58, had at least the grace to wince, though she did not correct her brother. She looked at Wren with an expression that was trying very hard to be sympathy and landing somewhere closer to relief that it hadn't been her. Honey, she said, he wasn't himself those last years. You know how he got, up there alone, talking to himself half the time. This isn't, it isn't a real reflection of anything. Milo's hand found his mother's under the table. He was old enough to understand insult when he heard it dressed up as comfort. Wren did not answer either of them. She had learned, in 5 years of widowhood, that a woman who does not answer an insult in the room where it is spoken keeps something the insult was trying to take from her, and she had gotten very good, out of necessity, at keeping the little that was left to keep. "There's a codicil," Corrigan said, when the room had settled again. "Attached separately." Mr. Vale asked that it be read aloud only after the primary distribution and only in the presence of all three of you. He turned another page. "I, Corwin Vale, being of sound mind, wish it stated plainly that the observatory and its contents are given to Renata alone and are not to be considered a lesser portion of this estate, but a portion whose value I have chosen not to disclose to my other children at this time. I ask that none of them contest this decision, and I remind them that a man is not obligated to explain the shape of his own gratitude." Weston's jaw worked once. "What does that mean? Value he's chosen not to disclose?" "It's $1. The county assessed it themselves." "I can only read what's on the page, Weston," Corrigan said. And there was something in the old lawyer's voice, a carefulness that had not been there when he read the house and the accounts, that made Ren look up at him for the first time since she'd sat down. They left not long after. Weston shook Corrigan's hand with the brisk grip of a man closing a deal he considered beneath him. Priscilla kissed Ren's cheek in the hallway, said something about lunch soon, and did not mean it, and both of them knew she did not mean it. Milo held his mother's hand all the way down the narrow wooden stairs to the street, where a thin cold rain had started, the kind that never quite commits to falling and just hangs in the air, turning everything the color of old nickel. Corrigan caught her at the door before she reached it. "Mrs. Vale, a moment, if you have one. Alone, if the boy doesn't mind waiting by the window." Milo went to the window without being asked twice, the way boys do when a grown-up wants privacy and a 12-year-old is smart enough to pretend he isn't listening anyway. Corrigan reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and drew out a small brown envelope, sealed, her name written across the front in a hand she knew as well as her own. Upright, careful, the hand that had signed 12 years of birthday cards and, in the last 2 years, had begun to shake at the tail of every letter that required a downstroke. "He came in alone to write this," Corrigan said. "Back in the spring, before his hip went bad. He sat where you're standing now and made me promise I'd put it in your hand myself, after the reading, when the other two had gone. Nobody else has seen it. Nobody else knows it exists." Ren took it. It was lighter than she expected, and yet her hand dropped an inch when she held it, the way a hand will sometimes anticipate a weight that hasn't arrived yet. "He wasn't confused, Mrs. Vale," Corrigan said, "and he said it the way a man says something he has decided in advance he is going to say regardless of whether anyone asks him to. I want you to hear that from me and not from your husband's brother. I've drafted wills for 40 years. I know a man whose mind is slipping when I see one sitting across this desk from me. And your father-in-law, the last time he sat in that chair, was the sharpest client I had that whole year. He knew exactly what he was giving away, and exactly who he was giving it to, and exactly why." She did not open the envelope in the office. She did not open it on the drive home, though it sat on the passenger seat the whole way, and Milo, riding in the back because he'd offered his front seat to it without being asked, kept glancing at it the way a child looks at a wrapped present he has been told not to touch. She did not open it that night, after she had gotten Milo fed and bathed and into bed, and had sat for a while at the kitchen table of the rented duplex on Sycamore Street. The duplex whose rent she was 6 weeks from being unable to make if the hospital did not agree to another payment extension on Desmond's old bills that had somehow, in 5 years, refused to shrink no matter how much of her paycheck she fed them. She was afraid of it. That was the truth, plain enough to admit to herself once the house had gone dark and quiet around her. She was afraid that whatever was in that envelope would ask something of her she did not have left to give. And she had spent 5 years learning to be careful about what she let herself want, because wanting things she could not have had cost her more than the wanting itself was ever worth. So she left it on the kitchen table, propped against the sugar bowl, and she went to bed, and in the morning she went to work, because a lab technician who draws blood for a living does not get to take a day to grieve a father-in-law who had already been dead 3 weeks by the time the will was read, not when the hospital's billing department calls twice a week, and the landlord's patience has a bottom to it same as everyone else's. To understand why a dollar tower on a mountain ridge could matter to a woman in that kind of trouble, you have to understand who Corwin Vale had been to her. And to understand that, you have to go back further than the will, back past the funeral. Back to a spring morning in 1988 when a 19-year-old boy named Desmond Vale drove his father's old flatbed truck up a logging road above the town of Larkin's Notch and helped him haul a second-hand telescope mirror blank up the last quarter-mile. On foot, because his father had told him that a man ought to build his own instrument if he ever wanted to trust what it showed him. Corwin Vale had been, by trade, an optical engineer, though the word covered only the smallest part of what he actually did with his hands. He had trained at a small technical institute in Rochester after the Korean War, had gone to work for Fenwick Precision Optics in the years when Fenwick still ground its lenses on the same floor where the company kept its offices, and had spent 11 years there developing a method for grinding aspheric surfaces that eliminated a particular distortion which had plagued wide-field telescope lenses for a generation. In 1974, he had sold the rights to that process in a transaction that never made the local paper because Corwin had never wanted it to, and had used a portion of the proceeds to buy 41 acres of ridge land above the town, where his own father had once run a small feed store, and had built, over the following 6 years, mostly with his own 2 hands and the occasional help of a hired mason, the domed observatory that would one day be worth $1 to the county tax assessor of Larkin's Notch. He married Miriam Ashe in 1959, a schoolteacher with a laugh Corwin used to say could be heard from the far side of the ridge on a still night, and they had 3 children in the years that followed: Weston in 1964, Priscilla in 1967, and Desmond, the youngest and the quietest, in 1971. Desmond grew up the way his father had grown up, more comfortable with his hands than his mouth, and while Weston chased his father's business sense down into boardrooms, and Priscilla chased something else entirely into a life of country club luncheons 2 counties over, Desmond spent his teenage evenings up on Halcyon Ridge learning to read the sky the way other boys his age were learning to read box scores. Ren met Desmond in 1997, when she was a nursing student at the community college in the valley, and he was working weekends at a hardware store to save for a house on land his father had given him at the eastern edge of the same 41 acres. A small parcel Corwin had carved off and deeded to him outright the year Desmond turned 25, the only piece of Vale land that had ever passed to a child free and clear, without strings, without a board meeting, without Weston's name anywhere near the paperwork. They married in 2000. Milo was born in 2013, a late and much-wanted child, after years of trying that Ren did not speak about even now, not to Priscilla's pitying luncheon questions, not to anyone. Desmond was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in the autumn of 2018. He fought it for 18 months with the same quiet, unhurried patience his father brought to grinding a mirror, and he died in the spring of 2020, in a hospital room 40 minutes from the ridge he'd grown up under, with Ren's hand in his and Milo, 7 years old, asleep in the chair by the window because it had gotten too late in the night for a child that age to stay awake for what was coming. Corwin did not come to the hospital in the final days. He had never been a man who could sit easily with dying, not since he'd lost Miriam to a stroke in 2011 and had gone, in the years after, further and further up into the isolation of the ridge, as though the mountain itself were a kind of argument against the fact that people leave. He came to the funeral in a black suit that had not fit him in a decade, sat in the front pew beside Weston and Priscilla, and said almost nothing to anyone, and Run, grieving and exhausted and 27 years old inside a body that felt 40, had hated him a little for it. In the raw, honest way grief allows you to hate people for their own grief when you have none left over to spend on understanding it. What changed that was Milo. The boy had loved his grandfather's mountain the way children love places that feel bigger than the ordinary rules of the world, and in the weeks after the funeral, when Ren did not have the strength to invent a reason to say no, Milo had asked, again and again, if they could go see Grandpa Corwin, if they could go up to the dome, if they could look through the big telescope one more time. She had finally driven him up on a Sunday in June, 6 weeks after Desmond's death, meaning to stay 20 minutes, meaning only to let the boy say hello and satisfy whatever grief-filled hole he was trying to patch with starlight. She had stayed 4 hours. Corwin had made cocoa on the little hot plate he kept in the dome's cramped kitchen alcove, had poured it into 2 dented tin cups, one of which had a small dent in the rim shaped almost exactly like a crescent moon, a dent that had been there, he told Milo, since 1979, when he dropped the cup building the very telescope pier the dome now stood over. He had let Milo look at Saturn that night, The boy's first real look at the rings through good glass, and Run, standing at the open shutter of the dome with her own cocoa going cold in her hands, had watched her son's face when he pulled back from the eyepiece, lit up in a way she had not seen since before Desmond got sick, and she had understood, without either of them saying it, that this ridge was going to become a place they needed. There was a night in August of that first summer, a Perseid shower Corwin had marked on his wall calendar 3 months in advance in the same careful hand he used for everything. When he woke Milo at midnight from a nap on the old army cot in the workshop and led him out onto the flat gravel apron beside the dome with a wool blanket over both their shoulders, and Rin had followed, half asleep herself, expecting nothing more than a few streaks of light and a tired drive home. They lay on their backs on that blanket for 2 hours. Corwin counted the meteors out loud in a low, steady voice. 41, 42, the same number as the acres, he said once, and laughed at his own joke in a way Rin had never heard him laugh before. And somewhere around 1 in the morning Milo had turned his face toward her in the dark and said, without any of the careful weight a 7-year-old usually gives to a hard question, "Is this what Daddy sees now?" And Rin had not had an answer, and Corwin, on the other side of the boy, had reached over without a word and put his hand flat on his grandson's chest, over his heart, and left it there until Milo's breathing evened out into sleep against the gravel. And that was the moment, more than any other in 5 years, when Rin understood that this silent, difficult, unreachable man was going to become the closest thing her son had left to a father, and that she was going to let him. They went back the next Sunday, and the Sunday after that. It became, over the 5 years that followed, the fixed point of their week, the thing Rin scheduled her overtime shifts around. The reason Milo learned to identify 11 constellations before he could reliably do long division. Corwin taught the boy to grind a small lens by hand, the same slow, patient way he'd learned it himself 70 years before, guiding Milo's fingers on the polishing lap, telling him the glass would tell him when it was ready if he learned to listen with his hands instead of his eyes. He taught Rin things too, though she had not expected to be taught anything, at 34, by a man who had once frightened her with his silence. He taught her the names of the visible planets and how to find true north without a compass, and, without ever quite saying so directly, he taught her that grief did not have to be loud to be real, that a man could love a daughter-in-law he rarely spoke 10 sentences to in an evening, simply by leaving the dome unlocked every Sunday and having the cocoa hot when her car came up the gravel. She had not known, in any of those 5 years, what he did with his solitary hours the other 6 days of the week. She had not asked. She had assumed, the way people assume about the elderly, that he was simply alone up there, tinkering, aging, waiting. She had assumed wrong, though she would not learn how wrong for another several days. The Tuesday before the will reading, the hospital's billing office had called her at work, a courtesy she had asked for years ago, because she could not bear the phone ringing at home while Milo did homework at the kitchen table close enough to hear every word. The woman on the line, not unkind, only tired in the particular way of someone who makes this same call 40 times a day, had explained that the remaining balance on Desmond's final 6 months of treatment, $11,400 after 5 years of a payment plan that never seemed to move the number by much, was being sent to a collections agency unless Rin could bring the account current within 30 days. Rin had stood in the hallway outside the hematology lab with her badge still swinging from its lanyard and had done the math she had done 100 times before. Rent due on the 1st, Milo's winter boots he'd already outgrown the pair from last year. The truck's front left tire that had a slow leak she'd been topping off with a gas station pump for 2 months rather than pay for a patch. There was no version of that math that came out even. She had told the woman on the phone she would call back with a plan, and she had not yet called back, because she did not have one. And some mornings the not having one sat on her chest the way grief itself used to sit on her chest in the first year, heavy and specific and impossible to argue with. She thought of that call again on the morning after the will reading, standing at her own kitchen counter with a cold cup of coffee and Corwin's dollar tower somewhere behind her eyes, and she felt the particular shame of a woman who has just been reminded that she is, on paper, richer this week than she was last week by exactly $1, and that the reminder had come wrapped in her brother-in-law's laughter. The morning after the will reading, she went to work at the hospital lab as she always did, drew blood from 41 patients between 7 and 3, ate a granola bar standing up in the break room, because she hadn't had time to sit, and drove home past the turn for Halcyon Ridge without letting herself look at it. The way you avoid looking directly at a wound you know is going to need cleaning eventually. It was not until the third night, a Saturday, after Milo had gone to bed and the duplex had gone that particular kind of still that only comes after a child is finally, fully asleep, that she sat back down at the kitchen table, made herself a cup of tea she did not really want, and picked the brown envelope back up off the sugar bowl. She turned it over twice in her hands before she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds, and a small brass key on a loop of waxed twine. Old, the kind of key with a long barrel shaft and a simple ward cut that told her, without her needing to be a locksmith, that it opened something built before locks got complicated. She unfolded the letter first. Ren, it began, no salutation beyond her name, the way Corwin had always written to her, direct and unadorned. If you are reading this, I am gone, and Nathaniel has done as I asked and kept his mouth shut about it, which I appreciate more than he will ever know, since keeping his mouth shut is not a skill lawyers are generally known for. I want you to go up to the dome alone. Not with Weston, not with Priscilla, and not, at first, with Milo, though you may bring him later, when you understand what you are looking at well enough to explain it to a boy who is going to inherit more of my temperament than either of my other children ever did. There is a key in this envelope. It opens the dome door, which you already know how to open, and it opens one other thing, which you do not yet know exists. I am not going to tell you what that is. I spent a great deal of my life being a man who explains himself too little to the people who loved him best, and I am not going to start correcting that failure now, in a letter, when I have had 80 years and could not manage it out loud. What I will tell you is this. Look up before you look down. The dome was never the valuable part of this place, though everyone in my family, including me for far too many years, treated it as though it were the only part that mattered. Read what is on the shelves before you go looking for what is under the floor. And when you find the ledgers, and you will find them, read them slowly. They took me 50 years to fill. They will not take you an evening to understand, but give them more than an evening anyway. You have earned the time it will take, and so, I think, have I. One more thing. There is a woman named Odette Coyle who lives at the bottom of the Ridge Road, in the old Coyle farmhouse with the blue shutters. She has kept the padlock oiled and the roof patched for longer than you know. She will not tell you anything you have not asked her directly. That was my instruction to her, and she is the most faithful keeper of an instruction I have ever known in my life, including myself. Ask her the right questions, and she will answer every one of them. I loved your husband very much, and I did not know how to say so while he was alive, which is a regret I carried up that mountain every night for 5 years after he died. I did not make the same mistake with you, or I tried not to, though I suppose you will be the judge of whether I succeeded. Go up to the ridge, Ren. Take your time. The mountain isn't going anywhere, and neither, as it turns out, is what I've left inside it. Corwin, she read it twice. She did not cry, not that night, though she came close somewhere around the 4th sentence and had to set the letter down on the table and breathe for a minute before picking it back up. There was something in the specific weight of his instructions, look up before you look down, that snagged in her chest and would not let go, a puzzle wrapped inside a grief she had not finished feeling yet. She waited until the following Saturday to go, partly because her work schedule did not allow for it sooner, and partly, she would admit to herself only much later, because some part of her wanted to sit with the not knowing a little longer, the way a person sometimes wants to hold an unopened letter from someone they've lost, because once it's opened there's nothing left to look forward to receiving. Milo begged to come. She almost said yes, out of habit, out of 5 years of Sunday drives up that same gravel road. But Corwin's letter had been specific, and she found, when she actually weighed the boy's disappointed face against the strange careful instruction in his grandfather's hand, that she trusted the dead man's judgment on this one particular point more than she trusted her own instinct to comfort her son. She left Milo with a neighbor, an older woman named Frances who had watched him plenty of times before and asked no questions when Rin said only that she had some things of Corwin's to sort through. The drive up Halcyon Ridge in late November was different from the drive up in June. The gravel road climbed through hardwoods that had already dropped their leaves, so that the whole mountainside had gone the color of old iron, gray and brown and streaked here and there with the dark green of pine that did not bother to change. The fog sat low in the hollows the way it did most mornings that time of year, thinning as the road climbed, until by the time she came out onto the open shoulder where the dome stood, the sky above the ridge had gone a hard, clear blue that made the whole valley below look like something seen through the wrong end of a telescope, small and far away, and almost unbearably clean. The dome itself looked smaller than she remembered, and somehow larger too, the way places from childhood or grief always seemed to hold two sizes at once. Its copper skin had gone the deep green of long weathering, streaked in places with rust bleeding down from the seams around the shutter track. The wooden outbuilding beside it, where Corwin had kept his tools and his hot plate and the two dented tin cups, had a section of roof that had clearly been patched within the last year, new shingles standing out pale against the old gray ones, and Rin stood at the edge of the gravel turnaround for a long moment just looking at that patch, wondering who had climbed up there to lay it, since as far as she knew, no one in the family had set foot on this ridge since the funeral. She had the key in the pocket of her coat. She had also, without quite deciding to, brought a flashlight, a pair of work gloves that had been Desmond's, and a thermos of coffee she had not touched the entire drive up. She walked the path to the dome door, the same path she'd walked 100 Sunday evenings with Milo's hand in hers, and she found the padlock hanging from the hasp already unlocked, the shackle swung open, as though someone had been there recently and had either forgotten to close it or had left it open on purpose, expecting her. She pushed the door inward. It swung on hinges that made almost no sound at all, oiled hinges, recently oiled, the smell of machine oil still faint in the cold air of the doorway. And beneath that smell, older and warmer, the smell she would have known anywhere in the world, blindfolded, machine oil, and old paper, and something faintly mineral, the smell of ground glass, the smell of her father-in-law, the smell of every Sunday evening of the last 5 years of her life compressed into one breath. She stood on the threshold for a long moment before she could make herself step through it. Inside, the dome was exactly as she remembered, and entirely unfamiliar at the same time. The great telescope stood in the center of the round room on its heavy iron pier, canvas draped over the eyepiece in the way Corwin always left it when he wasn't using it, a habit he called putting the instrument to bed. The walls curved up and away into shadow, and around the base of them ran the long, low shelving Corwin had built himself out of clear pine, dovetailed at the corners the way she remembered him teaching Milo to cut a joint, patient, exact, no nail anywhere in sight. On those shelves, where she had always vaguely registered rows of books without ever really looking at them, stood dozens of ledgers bound in dark leather, their spines lettered in gold gone dull with age, standing shoulder to shoulder like a small, silent congregation. She had walked past those shelves 100 times with a mug of cocoa in her hand and a boy tugging at her sleeve toward the eyepiece, and she had never once stopped to read a single spine. She stopped now. She set the thermos down on the workbench, and she reached out with one hand, Desmond's glove still folded uselessly in her coat pocket because some instinct told her this was not a job for gloves, and she drew the nearest ledger off the shelf, and the leather was warm in a way that made no sense in an unheated stone room in late November, warm the way a thing feels warm when it has been handled recently, by hands that were not her own. She opened it on the workbench under the cold gray light coming through the shutter gap, and the first entry, dated in a hand 30 years younger than the one that had signed her name to a birthday card only 2 years before, read simply, March, 1994. Repaired the Ashworth girl's telescope mount. No charge. Her father lost his job at the mill in January, and there was no money in that house for anything but groceries. But the girl has a mind for the sky that deserves better than a broken mount held up with a stack of hymnals. Told her father it was a warranty repair. It was not. I do not know why I lie to that man every single time, except that I believe it is easier for him to accept a gift if he is not asked to know it is one. Rin sat down slowly on the old wooden stool beside the bench, the ledger open on her knees, and outside, faint at first, and then unmistakable, she heard the sound of an engine climbing the gravel road toward the dome, and she looked up, and through the open door she could see, coming around the last bend below the turnaround, the shape of a small dented pickup truck she did not recognize, moving slowly, deliberately, the way a driver moves who has made this exact drive 1,000 times before, and is in absolutely no hurry to arrive. She stood, the ledger still open in her hands, and she did not know, standing there in the cold doorway of her father-in-law's observatory with 50 years of some stranger's kindness spread open on her knees, whether what was coming up that road was going to answer her questions or multiply them. The truck stopped at the edge of the turnaround. The woman who climbed down from it was small and straight-backed, somewhere past 70, in a canvas coat gone soft at the collar and a knit cap pulled low over gray hair, cropped close to her skull. She did not hurry up the path. She walked it the way a person walks a route they have walked 10,000 times, with the economy of someone who has stopped needing to look at their own feet. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. And when she reached the dome door, she stopped a few paces short of it and looked at Ren with a pair of pale eyes that took their time settling on her face. "You'll be Renata," the woman said. It was not a question. "Run," she said. "I'm sorry, I don't Odette Coyle." She said it the way a person states a fact rather than offers an introduction. "I live at the bottom of the road, the house with the blue shutters. I expect Corwin told you about me in that letter, or you wouldn't be standing here alone on a Saturday with that particular look on your face." Ren glanced down at the ledger still open across her forearm, and Odette's eyes followed the glance and did not look away from it. "He said you kept the roof patched," Ren said, "and the padlock oiled. I did more than that, but that's a fair start." Odette came up the last few steps and into the doorway, and stopped there, one hand resting on the frame, not entering further, as though the threshold itself belonged to someone else, and she was too well raised to cross it uninvited even now. "I've been coming up here twice a month for 11 years. Since before Miriam died, if I'm honest, though it was different work back then. I'm not going to tell you what any of this means, Mrs. Vale. Corwin was very particular about that. He said if I told you before you asked, I'd be robbing you of something, and he made me promise on his wife's grave, which is not a promise a woman my age breaks lightly." "Then ask me," Ren said. "Tell me what to ask you." Something moved at the corner of Odette's mouth that was not quite a smile. "That's the first sensible thing anybody in this family has said to me in 11 years. She looked past Ron, into the dome, at the shelf where the ledgers stood in their long, unbroken row, gold lettering catching what little light came through the shutter gap. "You found the books already. Good. He wanted you to start there before you started anywhere else. What have you read so far?" "One entry, about a girl named Ashworth, and a telescope mount, and a lie he told her father about a warranty." Odette nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected about how the morning would go. "There are 47 of those, near enough. He started the first one the year after he sold his patent, and he didn't miss a year until the month before he died. Though the last dozen entries are in a hand you'll have trouble reading. His fingers had gone bad by then, same as everything else on him went bad by then. Every person whose name is in those books came up this mountain broke, or scared, or grieving, or all three at once, with something broken in their hands that had nothing to do with the sky and everything to do with somebody they'd lost. He fixed telescopes for people who could not afford telescopes. He never once charged a fair price for it in 50 years, not to anybody who couldn't spare it, and he never once let a single one of them know they'd been given anything at all. He was better at hiding a kindness than any man I ever met, and I buried a husband who was pretty good at hiding things himself." Ren looked down at the ledger again, at the neat, patient handwriting, at the specific, unshowy cruelty of a father-in-law who had apparently spent 5 decades being generous to strangers while his own children believed him cold. Why would he hide it from his own family? From Weston, from Priscilla, even from Desmond? You'd have to ask him that, Odette said, and he's past answering. But I'll tell you what I think, since you asked me directly and I told you I'd answer what's asked directly. I think a man who grew up the way Corwin grew up, with a father who measured love in dollars earned and never once in dollars given away, learned early that if the people around him knew what he was worth, they would start seeing him as a resource before they saw him as a man. He watched it happen to men he knew. Rich men whose own children stopped visiting except at Christmas, and even then mostly to ask. I believe he decided somewhere along the way that the only way to know if anybody loved him for himself was to make certain nobody had a reason to love him for anything else. It cost him plenty. I think it cost him Weston and Priscilla both, in the end, though I don't believe either of them would put it that way. She paused, and her pale eyes came back to Wren's face, steadier now. It didn't cost him you. He told me that himself, more than once, sitting right where you're standing. He said Desmond's wife is the only one who ever drove up this mountain without wanting a single thing from me except my company. He said a great deal of store by that, Mrs. Vale, more than I think you understand yet. Wren felt her throat tighten in a way she had not expected, standing in a cold stone room with a stranger's pale eyes fixed on her. She looked away, toward the telescope under its canvas shroud, toward the long curve of the wall, anywhere that wasn't Odette's face, and it was in looking away that her eyes fell, for the first time, on the section of floor directly beneath the telescope's iron pier, where a worn oval rug lay slightly askew. One corner folded back on itself as though someone, recently, had lifted it and set it down again without quite smoothing it flat. "What's under the rug?" Wren said. Odette followed her gaze, and for the first time since she'd climbed out of the truck, something like hesitation crossed her face, a small flicker, there and gone. "That," she said, "is further along than I was told to walk you. Corwin's letter said look up before you look down. I expect he meant for you to read a good deal more of those books before your eyes ever landed on that rug. I've read one entry. Then you've got 46 left before you've earned the rest of it, by his reckoning, if not by mine." Odette straightened, and something in her posture said the visit, or at least this portion of it, had reached its natural end. "I'll not stop you if you want to look now. I gave him my word I wouldn't tell you what's under there, not that I'd stand in your way if you went looking yourself. But I'll say this much, and then I'll leave you to it, because the light's going to go soon and this ridge is no place for a woman to be climbing around alone after dark, even one who's spent 5 years learning her way up it. Whatever you find under that pier, it is going to change the shape of every conversation you have with Weston and Priscilla Vale for the rest of your life, and you would do well to have read every one of those books before that conversation starts, so that when they ask you what their father was, and they will ask you, you'll be able to tell them the truth instead of just the number." She left the way she'd come, without further ceremony, her boots quiet on the gravel, the old truck coughing once before it caught, and carried her back down the mountain in the last hour of good light. Wren stood alone in the dome for a long while after the sound of the engine had faded, the ledger still open across her arm, the wind picking up faintly against the copper dome overhead in a low, hollow note that Corwin had once told Milo was the sound the whole mountain made when it was thinking. She knelt, finally, beside the rug, and folded it back the rest of the way. Beneath it, set flush into the poured concrete of the pier's foundation, was an iron ring, hinged flat against a section of the floor cut so precisely along its seams that she would never have noticed it at all if she had not known, now, to look. She worked her fingers under the cold iron and pulled, and the slab did not move, not an inch, heavier than anything she could hope to lift alone with her bare hands and a coat, and a pair of borrowed work gloves, and she knelt there in the graying light with her breath fogging in front of her face, and her heart going harder than the effort alone could account for. And somewhere down the mountain, faint and already growing fainter, she could still hear the sound of Odette Coyle's truck working its way back toward the valley, carrying with it the last of the daylight and the first real shape of a secret Wren understood. Kneeling there on the cold floor of her father-in-law's observatory, she was not yet strong enough, in any sense of the word, to lift on her own. She sat back on her heels and looked at the sealed slab for a long moment. then reached out and smoothed the rug back over it, corner by corner, the way she might have straightened a blanket over a sleeping child, an instinct she did not examine too closely at the time and would think about often in the weeks that followed. She gathered the ledger she had been reading, wrapped it in Desmond's old work gloves so the cold would not bite at the leather on the drive down, and carried it out to her car with both hands, the way a person carries something they have only just learned to be afraid of dropping. The light was nearly gone by the time she reached the bottom of the ridge road, the valley below strung with the small scattered lights of Larkin's Notch coming on one window at a time, and she drove home slowly, the ledger on the passenger seat where the envelope had written 3 days before, and she found that she could not stop thinking of Odette Coyle's voice telling her that whatever waited under that floor was going to change every conversation she would ever have again with Weston and Priscilla Vale, and that she had better be ready with more than a number when the asking came. She picked Milo up from Francis's house a little after 7, and he chattered the whole ride home about a video game and a boy at school and whether they could get a dog someday. And she answered him the way she always did, present and warm and giving nothing away, though some part of her was still 40 minutes up a mountain, kneeling on a cold floor with her fingers hooked under an iron ring that would not lift. That night, after he was asleep, she sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open under the lamp and read until well past midnight. 46 entries still ahead of her, each one a stranger's name, a stranger's grief, a kindness her father-in-law had spent half a century making sure no one would ever trace back to him. And somewhere in the reading, somewhere around the 11th or 12th name, she stopped thinking about the rug on the floor of the dome entirely and started thinking instead about the man who had built a room specifically so that his own generosity could hide inside it. And she did not yet know that the room held more than kindness, that beneath the floor where her hands had failed to move a single inch of stone, the actual shape of what he had built for her was still waiting, patient as starlight. For the night, she would finally be ready to bring it up into the air. She did not go back up the mountain for 4 days. Not because she didn't want to, but because a woman who draws blood for a living 40 hours a week and raises a boy alone does not get to drop everything for a locked door under a rug, no matter what she suspects might be waiting on the other side of it. She went to work. She picked Milo up from school. She read 3 more entries from the ledger each night after he was asleep, sitting at the kitchen table under the same lamp, and by the 4th night, she had reached an entry from 1979 that stopped her cold enough that she had to set the book down and walk to the sink and run the water over her wrists for a minute before she could pick it back up. The entry was short. Built a second grinding jig this month. It read, for the boy who comes up on Thursdays after his shift at the mill. He is 19 and has more feel for a lap and a stroke count than any apprentice Fenwick ever sent me. And he has told no one at that mill that he spends his one free evening a week learning a trade that will never pay him what the mill does. I have decided I am going to leave him something when I am gone. Not money. Money ruins a hand like his. But knowledge. And perhaps, if I live long enough and he stays half as steady as he is now, something more than knowledge. His name is Simon Boyce. She knew that name. Everyone in Larkin's Notch knew that name, or thought they did. Simon Boyce, who ran the little machine and lock shop on Depot Street, who had a reputation for being able to open or repair almost anything with moving parts, and for saying almost nothing while he did it. She had taken her car key to him once, years ago, when the ignition cylinder seized in the middle of a February cold snap, and he had fixed it in 11 minutes for $12 and had not once looked her fully in the eye the entire time, though he had asked, in a low, careful voice, whether she was Desmond Vale's wife, and when she said yes, something in his face had changed for just a moment before he went back to being a man entirely occupied with a key cylinder. She called Odette Coyle the next morning before work, standing in her kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand, and asked her, plainly, the way Odette had told her to ask things, whether Simon Boyce could be trusted with what was under that rug. He's the only living soul besides me who Corwin trusted with a key to that dome, Odette said, on the other end of the line. You'll want him there when you open it. Not because you can't manage the tools yourself, though you likely can't. That plate weighs more than you'd guess, but because there are things down there a person needs someone steady beside them for. I'll tell him to expect your call. Simon came up the ridge on a Saturday morning in early December, driving his own truck behind Wren's, a battered green pickup with a toolbox welded into the bed and a magnetic sign on the door that read Boyce Lock and Machine, though the letters had faded enough that you had to already know what they said to read them clearly. He was 43, tall in the way of men who have spent a working life standing at a bench, with hands that looked older than the rest of him, scarred in small, precise places, the scars of a craftsman rather than an accident. He shook Ren's hand at the dome door with a grip that was careful rather than firm, the grip of a man who has learned to measure his own strength against things easily broken. His own history with Corwin, Ren would learn only in pieces over the following weeks, had started the way so much on this mountain seemed to start, with a father who wanted one thing from his son and a boy who wanted something else entirely. Simon's father had run the family sawmill down in the valley for 30 years and had assumed, without ever quite asking, that his only son would take it over when his own knees finally gave out. Simon had worked the mill through high school, had hated nearly every hour of it, and had discovered, almost by accident, at 17, that a broken pocket watch handed to him by a customer as a joke, fixed that if you're so clever, could occupy his hands and his mind more fully than anything the mill had ever offered him. Corwin had heard about the boy from Odette, who knew everyone in the county worth knowing, and had driven down to the mill himself one Saturday afternoon, unannounced, to ask Simon's father whether he might borrow his son for a few Thursday evenings a month to teach him a trade that had nothing to do with lumber. His father had refused, and had not spoken to Simon for the better part of a year after Simon defied him and started coming up the mountain anyway. And though the two men eventually found their way back to something like peace before his father died, Simon had told Ren once, much later, that he still believed Corwin Vale had saved his life simply by being the first grown man who ever asked him what he wanted instead of telling him what he was for. That debt, unspoken and enormous, was the reason he had climbed this ridge for free every month for over a decade to keep an old man's hinges from seizing. And it was the reason, Ren understood now, standing beside him at the mouth of a hidden staircase, that Corwin had trusted him with a key that opened doors far heavier than any lock Simon had ever cut for a living. Odette told me some of it, he said, once they were both standing over the rug, which Ren had folded back the moment she'd walked in, unable to make herself wait. Even the length of a greeting. Not much. She's not a woman who tells you more than she's been given leave to tell. He knelt and ran his fingers along the seam of the concrete slab the way another man might have run his fingers along a wound, gently, testing for the shape of the damage before deciding how to treat it. He built this himself. I helped him pour part of this floor in the autumn of 1982, though I didn't know then what we were pouring it over. There's a counterweight system under here. I'd bet money on it. Something that makes this liftable by one determined man with the right leverage instead of needing a crew and a crane. That would be like him. He never built anything he couldn't operate alone if he had to. He was right. It took the two of them the better part of an hour, working a length of pipe Simon had brought from his own shop as a lever, and a hand winch he bolted temporarily into an iron eye set into the pier itself. An eye Ren had walked past 100 times over 5 years and had always assumed was simply part of the telescope's original mounting hardware. But on the last turn of the winch handle, the great concrete slab tilted upward on a hidden hinge with a low grinding groan, counterweight just as Simon had guessed, swinging up and back to reveal not a crawl space, not a shallow cellar, but a narrow stone staircase cut directly down into the bedrock of the ridge itself, disappearing into a darkness that smelled, when the cold updraft of it reached her face, of dry stone and something faintly metallic underneath, an old, mineral, patient kind of cold. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Simon reached into his coat and produced a heavy rubber flashlight, clicked it on, and offered it to her without a word, the way a man offers a woman the first step into a room he already suspects belongs to her alone. You should go first, he said. Whatever's down there, he built it for you. I'll be right behind you the whole way. The staircase ran 19 steps down, each one cut clean and even into living rock, worn smooth in the center by the passage of feet over what must have been decades, and the walls on either side had been finished with the same careful hand that had built the shelves upstairs, dressed stone fitted so precisely that no mortar showed at all. At the bottom, a plain wooden door, unlocked, its hinges as freshly oiled as every other hinge on the property, and beyond it, when Ren pushed it open and swept the flashlight beam across the room, a chamber roughly the size of the dome above it, carved and finished into the heart of the mountain, and lined, floor to ceiling on 3 of its 4 walls, with the accumulated, silent, patient result of 50 years of a man's private and entirely unspoken second life. She played the lights slowly across the nearest wall first. Wooden crates, a dozen of them, stacked in neat rows and stenciled with faded lettering. She had to lean close to read, and when Simon pried the lid off the nearest one at her nod, the beam of the flashlight caught on the dull, heavy gleam of stacked gold bars, each one bearing a small hallmark stamp and a serial number, more gold in that single crate than Ren had ever seen outside of a movie screen. And there were 11 more crates exactly like it. The second wall held glass-fronted cases, custom-built, the same careful joinery as everything else Corwin had ever made with his hands, and inside them, mounted on small brass stands with typed identification cards beneath each one, lay stones. Dozens of them, some no larger than a fingernail, some the size of a fist, dark and pitted and strange, and Ren did not understand what she was looking at until Simon, standing close behind her shoulder, read one of the typed cards aloud in a voice gone unsteady in a way she had not heard from him yet. Lunar meteorite, he read. Recovered Sahara, 1999, Lab Verified University of Arizona, '08. He straightened and looked at the rest of the case with new understanding dawning visibly across his face. These aren't rocks, Run. These are pieces of the moon. This whole case is pieces of the moon and Mars and half a dozen asteroids nobody's ever named. And there are collectors who would sell a house to own one of these, let alone 40 of them. The third wall was different again, lined not with crates or cases, but with a locked steel filing cabinet for drawers, and beside it, a small writing desk not unlike the cherry desk from the workshop above, except this one was set with a single reading lamp, a leather chair, and a stack of envelopes tied with the same wax twine as the key that had opened the dome door in the first place, each envelope addressed in Corwin's hand, and Ren felt her knees go for a moment when she read the first name on the top envelope, because it was not addressed to her at all. It was addressed to Milo. She did not open that one, not yet. She set it aside with hands that had begun, finally, after everything, to shake, and beneath it she found 4 more, all addressed to her, and beneath those, at the bottom of the small stack, a single sealed document folder marked in Corwin's hand with words that made the whole room tilt very slightly around her, even in the flashlight's narrow beam. The Halcyon Ridge Trust. Full disclosure and accounting, to be read only by Renata Vale, or by whoever she designates in her stead. Simon had moved away from her, giving her the distance she needed without being asked, and was standing at the far end of the chamber examining a rack of instruments. Ren had not yet had the composure to look at herself, telescopes of an older style than the one upstairs, brass and dark wood. One of them bearing a maker's plate that even from across the room Ren could see was engraved in a script old enough to be another century entirely. "There's a Clark refractor over here," Simon said, his voice hushed in a way that had nothing to do with reverence for the dead and everything to do with the plain fact of what he was looking at. A real one. Alvin Clark and Sons. The plate says 1891. I've only ever seen photographs of instruments like this. Museums fight over these. There's 4 of them on this rack, Run, and I don't recognize the other 3 makers offhand, which either means they're obscure or they're older than anything I've studied, and knowing your father-in-law, I'd bet on older. Ren sat down slowly in the leather chair at the small desk, the folder marked full disclosure and accounting resting unopened on her knees, and for a long moment she did not move at all, did not open it, did not speak, simply sat in the cold stone quiet of a room her father-in-law had spent 50 years building in absolute secret. 30 feet beneath the floor where she had drunk cocoa out of a dented tin cup with a moon-shaped dent in the rim on 100 ordinary Sunday evenings, never once suspecting that the ground beneath her feet held anything but bedrock. She opened the folder. The first page was a letter, dated the previous spring, the handwriting shakier than the ledgers upstairs, but still unmistakably his own. "Ren," it began, "if you are reading this in this room, then you found the ring under the rug, and Simon, I expect, was steady enough to help you lift it, since I never once in 40 years asked that boy for help he wasn't able to give. I owe you an explanation, and since I am not a man who has ever been good at explaining himself out loud, I am going to try to do it here, on paper, where I can take the time to get it right. In 1974, I sold the rights to my aspheric grinding process to a company called Meridian Optical Systems, out of Rochester, for a sum that seemed enormous to me at the time and that I told almost no one about. Not even Miriam, not fully. What I did not tell my family, what I told no one except my attorney and, eventually, Odette, is that the sale included a small perpetual royalty, a fraction of a cent for every lens ground using my process, and that process ended up in nearly every wide-field telescope, satellite camera, and precision optical instrument manufactured in this country for the next 50 years. A fraction of a cent sounds like nothing. Over 5 decades, and billions of lenses, it is not nothing. I placed those royalties into a private trust under a name that was not my own, and I let the number grow and grow and grow, and I told no one, because I watched what money did to men I knew, and because I did not want my children to grow up believing their worth as human beings was tied to a number I had not yet decided how to share. The Halcyon Ridge Trust, as of the last accounting I received before my hands got too unsteady to manage the paperwork myself, holds approximately $310 million. The gold in the crates upstairs, I bought slowly, over decades, as a hedge, the old way, the way my own father never trusted paper money after the 30s. That comes to a little under $4 million, which will sound like a great deal of money to you, and will sound, once you have read the rest of this letter, like almost nothing at all. The meteorites, I began collecting in the 80s, through a small network of dealers who understood discretion and asked no questions, and the most recent appraisal I commissioned, 3 years ago now, valued the collection, including the lunar specimen, at roughly $90 million, though I am told such things move with the market and could be worth more today. The instruments, the Clark refractor and the 3 others beside it, I acquired one at a time over 40 years from estate sales and museum deaccessions, and a specialist out of Boston valued those, together, at just under $40 million the last time I asked. I have done the arithmetic for you so you will not have to sit with that room and a calculator, wondering. Taken together, run, what is in this chamber and in that trust comes to something in the neighborhood of $440 million. I want you to sit with that number for a moment before you read any further. I want you to remember, while you sit with it, that I did not build this room for the number. I built it because I did not trust a world that measures a man's worth in numbers, and because I wanted, before I died, to know at least one person in my family whose love for me had never once been auditioning for a share of it. That person was you. The letters in that stack are for you, one for each birthday you have had since your first Sunday visit, which I began the week after Milo told me you had once been a nursing student who dreamed, before life got in the way, of becoming a doctor. There is one for Milo as well, which you should give him when you judge him ready, and not one day before, because a boy that age should be allowed to love his grandfather's memory a while longer before he learns what that memory was sitting on. I did not leave anything from this chamber to Weston or Priscilla, and I want to explain that plainly, because I do not want you carrying guilt that belongs to a decision I made, not you. I love them both. I love them the whole of their lives, in whatever broken way I was capable of loving anyone after I lost Miriam. But in 5 years of watching the 3 of you, I saw only one of my children's spouses drive up this mountain every single week asking nothing of me but my company, and I saw a son and a daughter who visited twice a year and left with a list, spoken or not, of what they hoped might one day be theirs. I am not punishing them. I am only, at the very end of a long life, refusing to keep pretending that all 3 of my children carried me equally, when only one of them, through you, ever really did. You will need to move carefully from here. There will be lawyers. There will, I suspect, be Weston, and I am sorry for that in advance, because he is my son and I love him, and I also know him well enough to know exactly what he will do when he learns what is under this floor. The trust documents in this folder name you sole beneficiary, properly executed, witnessed, and recorded, the same as everything else I have ever built. It will hold, but it will hold better and faster, and with less pain to everyone involved, if you go into whatever comes next already understanding what you are protecting and why, and knowing that the man who built this room believed, all the way to the end, that you had more than earned every dollar of it. Though I hope you will also understand, when you have had time to sit with all of it, that the dollars were never really the gift. The gift was that you never once asked me for them. I love you, Ren. I loved my son, and I love my grandson, and I loved you as completely as a difficult old man knew how to love anyone. Go slowly. Read the other letters when you are ready and not before. And when you finally do bring Milo down these stairs, tell him his grandfather built this room the same way he ground his first lens, one patient stroke at a time, waiting his whole life for the moment the glass would finally be ready to show him something true. Corwin Vale read it twice through, and somewhere partway through the second reading Simon had come to stand a respectful distance behind her, not reading over her shoulder, simply present, the way she imagined he had learned to be present at that workbench upstairs 40 years ago, a boy of 19 who had understood, without anyone ever telling him directly, that some silences are meant to be shared rather than filled. $440 million, she said finally, out loud, to no one in particular, testing the shape of the number in her own mouth the way a person tests a bridge before trusting their full weight to it. That's what it says, Simon said. His voice dropped low, and then, after a moment, I've known that man since I was 19 years old, and I would not have believed him capable of a secret this size, except that I am standing in the middle of it, so I suppose I have to. She did not cry, not down there in the cold stone room with the flashlight throwing long shadows across the crates and the cases and the row of unopened letters. The crying came later, that night, after Simon had helped her lower the slab back into place and secure it, and had driven his truck back down the mountain ahead of her with a promise to say nothing to anyone until she was ready, and after she had picked Milo up from Francis's house and fed him dinner and read to him and tucked him into bed exactly the way she did every other Saturday night of his life, giving him, for one more evening, the ordinary, unremarkable childhood he deserved to have, for just a little while longer before the shape of the world around him changed for good. It was only after his door was shut and the duplex had gone dark and still that she sat down at her own kitchen table, in the same chair where she had opened Corwin's first letter 3 weeks before, and put her face in her hands, and wept, not from grief exactly, though grief was in it, but from the sheer disorienting size of being seen, all the way to the bottom, by a man who had never once told her out loud that he was watching. She did not open Milo's letter, not that night, not the following week, though she carried the thought of it with her constantly, a small sealed weight at the bottom of her dresser drawer where she had hidden it beneath a stack of winter sweaters, waiting for a day she would know, without needing anyone to tell her, was the right one. But 2 nights after the chamber, unable to sleep, she did finally untie the twine around the 4 remaining envelopes addressed to her, and she opened the oldest one first, the one marked only with a year, 2000. Run, it began, in a hand younger and steadier than the one that had written to her from the chamber desk. You do not know me well yet. You have been married to my son for only a few months, and I have watched you at our table twice now, once at Christmas and once at Miriam's birthday, and both times I noticed the same thing, that you listened to my wife's stories about her mother's garden longer than either of my other children's spouses ever have, not out of politeness, but because you actually wanted to know the answer. I am writing this now, though I do not know when or if you will ever read it, because I have learned that gratitude delayed too long tends never to arrive at all. Thank you for choosing my son. He is quiet the way I am quiet, and I know from long experience how lonely that particular quiet can be for the person who loves us. Be patient with him. I intend to be. She read that one twice, thinking of Desmond at 29, healthy, unhurried, still 20 years from the diagnosis that would take him, and she felt the specific grief of remembering a version of a person the rest of the world had already forgotten existed. The next letter was dated 2013, the year Milo was born, and it thanked her, in Corwin's plain, unadorned way, for giving Desmond a son after years of trying that Corwin, apparently, had known about the whole time, though neither Rin nor Desmond had ever told him directly. The third letter, dated 2020, she almost could not make herself open at all, because she already knew, from the year alone, what grief it was going to be sitting inside. I do not know what to say to you this year. It read, that will not sound like every other empty thing people have already said to you since March. I lost my son. I understand you lost your husband, and that the 2 griefs, though they share a name, are not the same weight to carry, and I will not pretend to know which of us is carrying more. What I will tell you is that I watched you, at the hospital, in the last week, and I saw a woman hold a dying man's hand and keep her voice steady for a 7-year-old boy asleep in the corner, And I understood, watching that I had been wrong about something for a very long time. I had believed, since Miriam died, that grief was a thing best carried alone, up a mountain, behind a locked door. You taught me, without ever once trying to teach me anything, that it can also be carried in a chair beside a hospital bed with another person's hand in yours, and that the second way, though it costs more up front, leaves less wreckage behind it in the end. I am an old man learning a lesson I should have learned 40 years ago. Forgive me for taking this long. Thank you, again, for bringing my grandson up this mountain anyway, that summer, when you had every reason left in the world to stay home and grieve alone yourself instead. Rin sat with that one for a long while, the kitchen dark around her except for the single lamp, and when she finally set it down and picked up the last letter, the one marked simply with the current year, she found it was shorter than the others, only a few lines, written in the unsteady hand of the final entries in the ledgers upstairs. I am running out of good days to write in, it read. I want you to know, before whatever comes next comes, that giving you that room was not an act of charity, and I do not want you carrying it as one. It was payment, ruin, for a debt I could never have repaid any other way, the debt of watching you become, for my grandson, everything a mother and very nearly a father besides, all at once, without once asking anyone's permission to be tired. Take the room. Take all of it. And then, when you have caught your breath, go be the doctor you once told Miriam you dreamed of being, before life asked something else of you first. You have earned the right to want something for yourself again. I am sorry it took my death to give you the room to want it. She did not tell Weston or Priscilla anything, not that week, not the next. She met with Nathaniel Corrigan on a Tuesday, brought the trust documents from the chamber, and watched the old lawyer's face as he read through them, watched him take off his glasses twice and polish them on his tie, a habit she had never seen him need before. This is airtight, Mrs. Vale, he said finally, setting the folder down with the particular care of a man handling something considerably heavier than paper. I drafted your father-in-law's will myself, and I did not know a single word of this existed. He kept his own attorney for the trust, someone out of Charlotte I've never met, name of Adelaide Ferris, and I've already reached out to her this morning to confirm the instrument's standing. It is a spendthrift trust, irrevocable, properly funded and recorded for over 40 years. There is no ambiguity in it, no room for a challenge on the trust's validity itself. If anyone contests this, and I suspect you already know who I mean, they will not be contesting whether the trust is real. They will be contesting whether your father-in-law was competent when he decided you, and not his own children, should be the one to receive it. Was he competent? Ren asked, though she already knew the answer, had known it since the letter, since the ledgers, since 50 years of careful handwriting that never once wavered until the very last entries. More competent than most men I've represented at half his age, Corrigan said. I have his physician's letters on file from the trust's founding and from a competency evaluation he insisted on himself, unprompted, 18 months ago, specifically, he told me, in case anyone ever tried to say otherwise. He knew this day was coming, Mrs. Vale. He built every part of this to survive exactly the challenge I suspect is about to come. Corrigan arranged the appraisals himself. Over the following 2 weeks, through channels he assured her would draw no attention, specialists he had worked with before on other estates, men and women who valued their own discretion nearly as highly as their expertise. A gemologist and meteorite specialist named Dr. Priya Kessler drove up from a university lab in Atlanta on a Thursday in early December and spent 6 hours in the chamber with a loupe and a spectrometer and a notebook she filled twice over. And when she finally climbed back up the 19-stone steps into the December daylight, she stood blinking in the cold for a moment before she spoke. I have seen private collections before, Mrs. Vale, she said. I have never seen one built with this kind of restraint. Most collectors who can afford specimens like these want people to know they own them. Your father-in-law built a vault specifically so that no one would. The lunar piece alone, properly authenticated and sold through the right channel, could clear $30 million on its own. I'll have a full written appraisal to your attorney within the month, but I can tell you now the number in his letter was not exaggerated. If anything, given how the market for verified lunar material has moved in the last 3 years, it may be conservative. The gold took less time to confirm. A precious metals assayer from Charlotte who weighed and tested each bar against current spot price and returned a figure within a few $100,000 of what Corwin himself had written. The instruments took longest, an antiquarian scientific dealer flying in from Boston who spent 2 full days photographing and researching provenance on the Clark refractor and its 3 companions, tracing serial numbers through estate auction records that stretched back, in one case, to a Philadelphia observatory that had closed its doors in 1931, and who told Ren, on his second evening, over coffee at her own kitchen table because he had run out of daylight to work by, that he had not personally handled an instrument collection of this caliber in 30 years of practice. It was the trust itself, though, that took the longest to fully confirm, because it required Adelaide Ferris, the Charlotte attorney who had drafted it decades before, to pull records from a bank in New York that had absorbed Meridian Optical Systems in a merger sometime in the 90s and had gone on administering the royalty stream without incident ever since, under an account name that traced back, through 3 levels of paperwork, to a Delaware entity Corwin had set up the same autumn he built the observatory's floor. The final accounting, when it arrived in a certified envelope the week before Christmas, confirmed the balance at $314 million, $4 million more than Corwin's own last estimate, because the market that year had been kind to the kind of conservative, patient investments a careful old man tended to favor. Taken together, the 4 appraisals came to $441,600,000, close enough to the number in Corwin's letter that Ren understood, reading the final summary Corrigan laid across his desk for her, that her father-in-law had known, almost to the dollar, exactly what he was leaving behind, and had chosen, even so, to write it down for her in round and gentle language rather than the cold precision of a balance sheet, because he had wanted the first person to learn that number to hear it from him, in his own voice, before she ever had to hear it from a stranger with a clipboard. She still told neither Weston nor Priscilla, not through the appraisals, not through the quiet stretch of December that followed. Word travels strangely in a small mountain town, not through newspapers or official channels, but through the slow capillary spread of small conversations. A teller at the bank who noticed an unusual deposit inquiry. A clerk at the county recorder's office who mentioned to her cousin that somebody'd been asking after old deed filings on Halcyon Ridge. A man at the hardware store who'd sold Simon Boyce an unusual quantity of winch cable and couldn't help wondering out loud to the next customer what a locksmith needed with gear like that. By the second week of December, less than a month after the will reading, Ren came home from a double shift at the hospital to find a business card wedged into her own front door, cream-colored, embossed, the name Julian Ashcroft printed above the words Halberd Aerospace Heritage Fund, and beneath his name, a private cell number and a single handwritten line. We understand you may have inherited items of significant historical and scientific interest. We would very much like to discuss acquisition terms at your earliest convenience. She stood on her own front step in the cold with the card in her hand for a long time, Milo's backpack still slung over her shoulder from the school pickup, and she understood, standing there, that whatever quiet, careful unfolding she had imagined for herself, weeks to read the letters, months to understand the ledgers, a slow patient walk into a fortune the way her father-in-law had built it one patient year at a time, had just run out of road considerably faster than she was ready for. She called Corrigan first thing the next morning. He was not surprised, not exactly, though his voice had gone graver than she'd heard it since the day he handed her the envelope. "These things get out, Mrs. Vale," he said, "especially where meteorites and antique instruments are concerned. There's a whole world of private collectors and specialty dealers who watch estate filings the way other men watch stock tickers, and Halberd has a reputation for moving fast and moving aggressively once they've caught a scent. I'd advise you not to call that number yet, not until we've had proper appraisals done through channels we control, and not until you've decided, clearly, in your own mind, what you actually want to do with any of this. But I'll tell you plainly what concerns me more than Mr. Ashcroft and his card. If a stranger from an aerospace fund in another state already knows enough to leave that message on your door, your brother-in-law is going to know a great deal more than that by Christmas, and knowing Weston, he is not going to learn it, and simply let the matter rest." He was right, though it took until the 3rd week of December, 10 days before Christmas, for the call to come. Ren was standing in her kitchen unloading groceries when her phone rang, Weston's name on the screen, and she almost let it go to voicemail out of an instinct she did not examine too closely, before deciding, in the end, that a woman who has spent 5 years being underestimated by this particular man owed it to herself to hear exactly what he had to say while she still had the composure to say something back. Run. His voice was different than it had been in Corrigan's office. Careful in a way Weston's voice was rarely careful. The voice of a man choosing each word for what it might later be used to prove. I've been doing some reading. Estate matters, mostly, tying up loose ends on Dad's business interests, the Fenwick shares, that sort of thing. And I came across something in his old files I didn't expect. A patent sale from 1974. Meridian Optical Systems. Do you know anything about that? She set the can of soup she was holding down on the counter very carefully, the way a person sets down something they suddenly understand they might otherwise throw. I know he sold a patent, Weston. A long time ago. For a great deal more money than anyone in this family was ever told about, Weston said, and the careful tone was fraying now, something harder coming up underneath it. I've had an old friend at a firm in Charlotte look into public filings, ruin, patent sale records, royalty structures on processes like his, the kind of thing that gets talked about in industry circles even 50 years later. I don't have hard numbers. I don't need hard numbers to know when something doesn't add up. Dad lived like a monk on that mountain for 30 years. He never once asked any of us for a dime, never spent a fraction of what a man in his position could have spent, and I always assumed that was just who he was, frugal, private, whatever word you want to use. But a man doesn't. Build a habit of silence that deep around nothing, Ren. And a man doesn't leave a dollar tower to his daughter-in-law, out of every asset he owned, unless there's something about that tower worth a great deal more than $1. Ren did not answer right away. Through the kitchen window, she could see Milo in the small backyard, throwing a tennis ball for the neighbor's dog in the last gray light of the afternoon, laughing at something, entirely unaware that the ground beneath his whole life had shifted weeks ago and was still, even now, settling into its new and permanent shape. What is it you're asking me, Weston? I'm asking you, he said, and his voice had gone very flat now, very final. The voice she imagined he used in the boardroom's run had never once been invited into. Whether there is something in that observatory my father did not disclose to this family, something you have already found, and something you have any intention of sharing with the 2 children who actually share his blood. He disclosed it to me, Ren said, and she was surprised, even as she said it, at how steady her own voice sounded. In his will, in writing, he made his choice a long time before he died, Weston, and he made it clear-headed and sound-minded, with his own attorney and his own doctor's letters on file to prove it. I'm not hiding anything from you. I'm simply not obligated to hand you an inventory before you've asked me a single honest question about how your father actually spent the last 5 years of his life, since as far as I can recall, you never once asked him yourself. The silence on the other end of the line went on long enough that she thought, for a moment, he had hung up. You'll be hearing from my attorney, Weston said finally, and his voice, when it came back, had lost every trace of the careful, probing tone it had carried at the start of the call. This isn't finished, Ron. Whatever that room is worth, it does not simply belong to you because a lonely old man liked the way you drove up his mountain on Sundays. There are 3 children in this family, and I intend to see that all 3 of us are treated fairly, whether that happens across a table or in front of a judge. The line went dead. Rin stood in her kitchen for a long while afterward, the groceries still half unpacked on the counter, watching her son laugh in the fading light with a tennis ball and a borrowed dog. And she understood, with the particular clarity that comes only after the worst of a thing has already been said out loud, that the quiet, patient unfolding her father-in-law had spent 50 years building toward was about to collide, very soon and very publicly, with exactly the kind of fight he had built every last piece of it to survive. Priscilla called 2 days later, on a different register entirely, though Rin could hear, underneath the softness of her sister-in-law's voice, the same current of alarm that had driven Weston's call, only wearing a gentler coat. Weston told me some of it, Priscilla said, or what he thinks he knows, which with Weston is never quite the same thing as what's actually true. Rin, honey, I'm not calling to fight with you. I don't have the stomach for what Weston's planning, lawyers and depositions and all of it, dragging Daddy's name through a courtroom 8 months after we buried him. I just want to understand. Did he really leave you all of it? The whole of whatever's up there? He left me a room. Priscilla, Rin said carefully. What's in it is complicated, and I'm not going to try to explain it over the phone before the appraisals are even finalized. But yes, he made his choice, and he made it a long time before he died, and he made it clear-headed. There was a long pause on the line, longer than Rin expected, and when Priscilla spoke again, something in her voice had changed, gone smaller, more honest than Rin had heard it in years. I used to bring the boys up there every other Christmas when they were small. Did you know that? Before you and Desmond married, before any of this, Daddy would let them look through the eyepiece for exactly 10 minutes, and then he'd say his eyes needed rest and send us back down the mountain, and I always told myself that was just who he was, private, difficult, not built for company. I never once thought to ask him to teach me anything, the way you apparently let him teach you and that boy of yours for 5 years running. I was too busy being embarrassed of a father who lived in a tin dome on a mountain instead of a house I could describe at a dinner party, without people asking follow-up questions. She stopped, and Rin heard her take an unsteady breath on the other end. I'm not asking you for money, Rin. I want to say that plainly, because I know that's what Weston's lawyer is going to assume the minute this call comes up in whatever he's building. I'm asking whether there's anything left up there that was mine to have missed. Anything that was ever, even once, meant for me. Rin thought of the sealed folder in the chamber desk, of the small stack of items she had cataloged but not yet fully absorbed, jewelry boxes among the crates that she had not opened, a woman's handwriting she did not recognize on one of the smaller cases. She thought of Miriam Vale, dead 14 years now, whose sapphire brooch Priscilla had already inherited from the primary estate, and she wondered, for the first time since the chamber door had swung open, whether her father-in-law's careful, patient withholding had cost his daughter something he had never quite meant to take from her. I don't know yet, Rin said honestly. But I'll look, Priscilla. I promise you that much, whatever your brother decides to do about the rest of it. Thank you, Priscilla said, and her voice had gone thin enough that Rin understood, without being told, that she was crying, somewhere in a kitchen 2 counties away, over a father she had spent her whole adult life keeping at exactly the polite, embarrassed distance he had apparently spent his whole life expecting from her. Whatever happens with Weston, I want you to know I'm not going to be standing beside him in a courtroom. I'm too tired for it. And I think, God help me, I finally understand why he left that room to you and not to us. I just wish I'd understood it while he was still alive to hear me say so. She hung up before Rin could answer, and Rin stood in her kitchen a long while after that call too, turning over the 2 conversations against each other, her brother-in-law's cold, lawyered fury on one side and her sister-in-law's small, late, unguarded grief on the other, and she understood that whatever came next, however Weston's threatened lawyers chose to fight it, this family's reckoning with what Corwin Vale had actually been was only just beginning, and it was not going to divide along the lines any of them, including Rin herself, had expected when the will was first read aloud in that narrow office above the hardware store on Main Street. 3 days later, on a Friday afternoon 2 weeks before Christmas, a courier in a gray sedan Rin did not recognize pulled into the duplex small gravel lot while she was still in her scrubs from the morning shift and handed her, against a clipboard she was asked to sign without being told what she was signing for, a thick envelope bearing the letterhead of a law firm in Charlotte she had never heard of, 3 names across the top in heavy black type, the middle one belonging, she saw when she finally made herself open it standing on her own front step in the cold, to an attorney Weston had apparently retained the same week he'd called her kitchen phone, with his voice gone flat and final, and inside, beneath a cover letter she read twice before the words fully settled into meaning, was a formal notice of intent to contest the validity of Corwin Vale's estate distribution, filed that morning in Buncombe County Superior Court. Corrigan read the notice twice at his desk 2 mornings later, the same careful, unhurried reading he gave to everything that mattered. And when he finally set it down, he did not look surprised so much as tired in a specific way Rin had not seen on him before. The tiredness of a man who has spent 34 years watching families do this exact thing to each other and had hoped, this once, to be spared it. He's alleging undue influence, Corrigan said. Not on the will itself, he can't touch that. It's been probated clean and Weston's own signature is on the acknowledgement of receipt. He's going after the trust, arguing your father-in-law lacked the capacity to understand what he was signing when the Halcyon Ridge instrument was amended 18 months ago to name you sole beneficiary outright, rather than the earlier version, which apparently split the corpus 3 ways. He tapped the page. There was an earlier version, Mrs. Vale. I want you to know that before you hear it from Weston's attorney in a courtroom, because it is going to come up, and it is going to sound worse coming from him than it does coming from me. Rin felt something cold move through her chest. An earlier version. Adelaide Ferris told me when she pulled the full file. The trust, as originally drafted, back in the 90s, split the corpus evenly among all 3 of his children upon his death, standard enough for a man of his means at the time. He amended it 18 months ago, shortly after that competency evaluation I mentioned, striking Weston and Priscilla entirely and naming you sole beneficiary. Weston's attorney is going to argue that a man does not disinherit 2 of his 3 children on a whim, that something must have changed, someone must have influenced him, and he is going to point at you, Mrs. Vale, at 5 years of Sunday visits and cocoa in a tin cup, and he is going to try to make a jury or a judge believe that what looks to us like love looked, from the outside, an awful lot like a woman working a lonely old man for his fortune. That's not what happened. I know that, Corrigan said. I knew your father-in-law for 30 years, and I have read every word he ever wrote down about you. In that ledger, in those letters, and there is no universe in which Corwin Vale was a man anyone could influence against his will, not even a woman he loved as much as he apparently loved you. But knowing it and proving it to a judge who has never met either of you are 2 very different exercises, and I want you prepared for how ugly Weston's attorney is going to make this before we ever set foot in that courtroom. He was right about the ugliness, though it did not come, at first, from the courtroom at all. It came, in the 2 weeks that followed, in smaller and more personal ways, the particular kind of pressure a family applies when it has decided that love and money have become impossible to separate from one another. A certified letter arrived from a surveying firm out of Asheville, retained, the cover sheet made clear, by counsel for Weston Vale, requesting access to the Halcyon Ridge property to assess an easement dispute regarding the gravel road, an easement Rin's own deed research, conducted hastily with Simon's help over a weekend, revealed had never actually existed as a legal question until the moment Weston's attorney needed one to exist. A building inspector from the county, a man Rin had never met and would later learn had golfed twice with Weston at the club in Asheville, showed up unannounced at the Dome one Saturday afternoon, while Rin and Milo happened to be there, and cited the structure, based on an anonymous complaint he would not name the source of, as a potential safety hazard pending a full engineering review, a review that would have required the Dome closed and sealed for months if Corrigan had not driven up himself that same evening and reminded the inspector, in a tone Rin had never heard him use, that harassment conducted at a client's direction through a public office was the kind of thing that ended careers, not just lawsuits. Word of the fight reached the Halbert Aerospace Heritage Fund almost immediately, the way vultures find trouble before it has finished happening, and Julian Ashcroft's cream-colored card was joined within the week by 2 more, one from a private auction house in New York and one from a collector in Texas who did not bother with a card at all and simply called Rin's cell phone directly, twice, before Corrigan advised her to stop answering unknown numbers entirely. Ashcroft himself came up the mountain in person on a Wednesday afternoon in January, while the contest was still pending and the outcome, from the outside at least, still genuinely uncertain, driving a black SUV with out-of-state plates up a gravel road built for a truck half its width, and Rin, who happened to be at the Dome that day cataloging instruments with Simon, watched him climb out in a wool overcoat entirely wrong for the weather and approach with the particular smooth confidence of a man who had never once in his career failed to close a deal simply because the seller said no the first time. Mrs. Vale, he said, offering a hand she did not take, since both of hers were occupied with a clipboard and a set of calipers. I'll be direct with you, since I understand you have a great deal on your plate at the moment. Halbert is prepared to make a very serious offer for the meteorite collection and the historical instruments both, structured however best suits your situation. A lump sum, a staged payment, whatever protects you from the tax exposure your attorney is surely already warning you about. And I'll be candid about something else too. A protracted family legal fight has a way of driving down the value of contested assets. Mrs. Vale, once word gets out, and word has already gotten out. Collectors get nervous about clean title. I'd hate to see you lose value simply because you waited too long to secure it. I appreciate you driving all this way, Mr. Ashcroft, Ren said, setting the clipboard down on the workbench with a deliberateness that made Simon, beside her, go very still and very interested in a set of calipers he had already finished measuring. But I'm not selling. Not the meteorites, not the instruments, not any of it. And I'd ask that you not come back up this road again without an invitation, since I don't recall extending one the first time either. Something flickered across Ashcroft's smooth expression, brief and unpolished. The first honest thing Ren had seen on his face since he'd stepped out of the car. You understand what you're sitting on, Mrs. Vale. Assets like these don't hold their sentimental value forever. Markets shift. Regulations shift. You may find, a few years from now, that the window you're standing in closes, and closes for good. My father-in-law built this collection over 50 years without once selling a piece of it to anyone, Ren said. He wasn't collecting an investment, Mr. Ashcroft. He was collecting evidence that the universe is larger and stranger and more patient than any single human life, and he wanted that evidence to end up somewhere it could teach people, not somewhere it could earn someone a commission. I intend to honor that, and I'd rather you heard it plainly from me today than keep driving up this mountain, hoping I might change my mind under pressure. He did not come back a third time, though his firm sent one further letter, weeks later, through a lawyer of its own, a letter Corrigan read, folded once, and set aside without comment beyond a short, satisfied exhale that told Ren everything she needed to know about how seriously it deserved to be taken. The other pressure, the closer, more personal kind that came from the easement letters and the building inspector rather than from a man in a wool overcoat, did not stop as easily, and it was in the middle of that harder stretch, when Ren had begun to wonder some nights whether the fight was worth the toll it was taking on her and on Milo both, that the mountain itself began, unexpectedly, to rise up around her. It started with a woman named Beatrice Alcorn, who arrived at the Dome on a gray Sunday afternoon in a car with Georgia plates, having driven 6 hours after reading a small item in a regional newspaper about a contested estate on Halcyon Ridge, an item that had mentioned Corwin Vale's name in passing and nothing else. She stood at the gate for a long moment before she worked up the nerve to knock, and when Ren opened the door, the woman, 60-some years old, introduced herself and said she had been a girl of 14 in 1981 when her family's telescope, her late father's telescope, the only thing of his she had left after he died in a mill accident, had stopped working, and a man she had never met had fixed it for the cost of the postage to mail it to him and back, and had included, in the box when it came home, a handwritten note explaining exactly how to keep the mirror clean so it would never need fixing again. She had read Corwin's name in that newspaper item and had not been able to stop thinking about it for 3 days, and she had driven up simply to say, to whoever would listen, that whatever anyone was saying about that man in a courtroom somewhere, she wanted it known that he had once been kind to a grieving 14-year-old girl in a way that had shaped the rest of her life, since she had gone on, because of that telescope and that note, to become an astronomer herself, retired now from a small state university outside Macon. She was not the only one. Over the following month, as word of the contest spread through the particular slow capillary channels, small towns and old ledgers both seemed to favor. 6 more people made the drive to Halcyon Ridge, some from as near as the valley below, some from 3 states away, each carrying a version of the same story, a broken instrument, a hard year, a debt that had never been asked to be repaid. Odette, when Ren mentioned it to her, was not surprised in the slightest. He kept every one of those names in his books for a reason, Odette said, sitting on the workshop's old bench with a cup of coffee Ren had made her, watching the fog move along the tree line below the dome. Not for himself. He never wanted a single one of them to know they'd been remembered. But he knew, I think, that a day like this one might come, a day when somebody tried to reduce his whole life to a number in a courtroom, and I believe some quiet part of him wanted to make sure there'd be people left standing who remembered it was never about the number at all. Ren gave Priscilla the jewelry box on a Tuesday evening in January, 3 weeks before the hearing was scheduled, driving it down to Priscilla's home herself rather than shipping it, because some things, she had decided, deserved to be handed over in person. She had found it in the chamber's third wall, tucked behind the filing cabinet in a space she had nearly missed a small cedar box with Miriam's initials burned into the lid, containing not jewelry at all, but a stack of sketchbooks. Miriam Vale's own hand. Watercolor studies of the night sky done from the dome's open shutter across 3 decades of summers. Dozens of them, dated and signed. A hobby none of her children, it seemed, had ever known their mother pursued in earnest. Tucked into the last sketchbook was a single loose page, unfinished, dated the spring before Miriam died. A half-painted rendering of the aurora she and Corwin had apparently once driven north to see together, and beneath it, in Miriam's own hand, a note that read simply, "For Priscilla, when she is old enough to want to know her mother better than a brooch could ever show her." Priscilla did not speak for a long while after she opened the box, sitting at her own kitchen table in a house Ruin had never once been invited into before that evening. And when she finally looked up, her eyes were wet in a way that had nothing performed about it at all. "He kept these for 40 years, she said, "and he never once thought to just give them to me. Even now, even leaving me nothing else, he couldn't just hand me my own mother's paintings without turning it into a scavenger hunt underneath the floor." "I don't think it was ever about making it hard," Ren said carefully. "I think he genuinely didn't know how to hand anyone anything directly. I've read enough of his letters now to believe that was the tragedy of him, not the cruelty of him. He built rooms instead of saying things out loud. It was the only language he ever fully trusted." Priscilla wiped her eyes with the back of one hand, a gesture that looked, for a moment, exactly like something a much younger woman might do, and said, "Weston isn't going to stop, you know. Whatever room full of grieving strangers you've got showing up on your doorstep, whatever my mother's paintings do to soften me. He's already spent $80,000 on attorneys this month alone. I saw the invoice. He left it on the kitchen counter at Mother's old house when we were sorting furniture. A man doesn't spend that kind of money on a fight he expects to lose gracefully." "I know," Ren said. "I'm not asking you to stop him. I know you can't. I only wanted you to have your mother's sky before whatever happens in that courtroom happens." The hearing was set for the second Tuesday of February, before Judge Everett Dunmore of Buncombe County Superior Court, a man in his 60s with a reputation, Corrigan told her on the drive down, for having exactly no patience whatsoever for what he privately called a state theater, families who dressed up simple greed in the language of concern for a dead parent's well-being. The courthouse sat on a square in downtown Asheville, granite and old brick, and Ren arrived that morning in the same charcoal dress she had worn to the will reading 3 months before. Milo left with Francis again, though this time he had asked, with the particular bluntness of a boy who had started, over the winter, to understand more than his mother had originally hoped he would, whether Uncle Weston was trying to take Grandpa's mountain away from them, and Ren had told him the truth, that his uncle believed something had gone wrong, and that a judge was going to decide whether he was right. The gallery was fuller than Ren expected. Beatrice Alcorn had driven up from Georgia again, sitting 3 rows behind the defense table beside 2 of the other visitors who had made their own pilgrimages to the Ridge that winter. Odette sat with Simon, both in clothes Ren had never seen either of them wear, careful and formal in a way that made her chest ache a little to see. Priscilla sat alone on the plaintiff's side, 2 rows behind her brother, close enough to be counted as family and far enough to make it plain, to anyone paying attention, that she was not standing shoulder to shoulder with him in this fight the way Weston's attorney had clearly hoped a united family front might read to the court. Weston's attorney, a sharp, precise man named Halloran who had flown in from a firm in Charlotte that specialized in exactly this kind of contest, opened with a presentation that ran nearly 50 minutes, methodical and careful, laying out the timeline of the trust amendment, the 5 years of weekly visits, the sudden disinheritance of 2 of Corwin's 3 children in favor of a daughter-in-law who had, Halloran was careful to point out several times, no blood relation to the deceased whatsoever. He called an expert witness, a geriatric psychiatrist who had never once met Corwin Vale, but had reviewed his medical records and testified, in careful, hedged language, that elderly patients with certain risk factors, isolation, grief, dependency on a single regular visitor, could become susceptible to what he termed relational influence, even absent any formal diagnosis of impaired capacity. He did not accuse Ren of anything directly. He did not have to. The shape of the argument did the accusing for him, laid out across an hour of careful, damning insinuation dressed in the language of medical caution. Corrigan rose when Halloran finally sat down, and where Halloran had been sharp and rehearsed, Corrigan was slow, almost conversational, a man who had learned, across 34 years in this same building, that a jury of one judge with no patience for theater responded better to plain fact laid out without ornament than to any kind of performance at all. He entered the competency evaluation first, conducted 18 months before Corwin's death at his own insistence, unprompted by any attorney, by a physician with no prior relationship to the family, finding him fully competent with no evidence of cognitive decline. He entered the physician's letters accompanying the original trust and its amendment both, each one independently commissioned, each one reaching the identical conclusion. He entered the ledgers themselves, 47 volumes, submitted not as evidence of Corwin's finances, but as evidence of his mind, 50 years of consistent, careful, legible reasoning that did not waver in its clarity until the very final months, exactly when the medical record said it should have begun to waver and not one day before. Corrigan called Wren herself before he called Simon, and she took the stand with her hands folded in her lap the way she had learned, years before, to sit in rooms where grown men were about to decide things that mattered. Halloran, on cross-examination, tried the angle Wren had known was coming since the moment she'd read the notice of contest, circling patiently at first, then more directly, toward the 5 years of visits, the cocoa, the closeness, building toward a question he clearly believed would land like a blow. "Mrs. Vale, isn't it true that you visited Corwin Vale every single Sunday for 5 years, without fail, arriving with your son, staying for hours, becoming, by your own account, the most frequent visitor in that man's isolated life?" "Yes," Wren said. "And isn't it also true that in all that time, you never once asked him for money? Never once mentioned your own financial difficulties, the medical debt from your husband's illness, the strain of raising a child alone on a lab technician's salary?" "That's true, too." Halloran paused, the pause of a man who believed he had just walked a witness into a trap of her own making. "Wouldn't you agree, Mrs. Vale, that a woman in genuine financial distress, visiting a wealthy, isolated, elderly man every week for 5 years, and never once mentioning that distress, might in fact be engaged in exactly the kind of careful, patient cultivation my expert witness described this morning? That the very absence of an ask could itself be a strategy?" Wren looked at him for a moment before she answered, and when she spoke, her voice came out steadier than she expected it to. "Mr. Halloran, I buried my husband when I was 34 years old, and for the first several months after, I drove my son up that mountain because he asked me to, and because I did not have the strength left over to invent a reason to say no. I did not go up there for 5 years hoping an old man would notice how tired I was and reward me for hiding it. I went because my son needed his grandfather, and because somewhere in the 2nd or 3rd month, I noticed I needed him too, in a way I hadn't expected and hadn't planned for. I never told Corwin about the debt because it never once occurred to me that it was his to solve. That's not strategy, sir. That's just what it looks like when a person keeps showing up for someone out of something other than what they might get from it. I understand that's a difficult thing to prove in a courtroom. I lived it for 5 years, and I promise you it was a great deal harder to live than it will ever be to explain." Halloran had no further questions. Judge Dunmore, Wren noticed, wrote something down on his legal pad at that moment and did not look up again until Corrigan called his next witness. He entered Corwin's ledgers next, 47 volumes in all, laid across the clerk's table as the physical record of a mind that had reasoned clearly and consistently for half a century, right up until the final months, exactly when the medical record said such clarity should have begun to fail and not one day before. And then he called Simon Boyce. Simon sat in the witness chair with the particular discomfort of a man who had spent his whole working life avoiding rooms exactly like this one, but his voice, when Corrigan began his questions, came out steadier than Wren had expected. "I've known Corwin Vale since I was 19 years old," Simon said, in answer to Corrigan's first question. "I witnessed the original trust document in 1994 when I was barely out of my apprenticeship with him, and I witnessed the amendment 18 months ago, the one Mr. Halloran is contesting today. I sat across a table from that man both times, 31 years apart, and read every word of what I was signing before I signed it, because that's the habit he taught me. Read a thing all the way through before you trust your name to it. He was sharper the second time than he'd been the first, if I'm honest. He made me read the amendment back to him twice, out loud, to make sure I hadn't misunderstood a single clause. That is not the behavior of a man being led somewhere he didn't mean to go. Halloran, on cross-examination, tried to suggest that Simon's decades-long relationship with Corwin and his own long-standing friendship with Run made him something less than an impartial witness, and Simon, without raising his voice, without so much as shifting in his chair, answered, "I'm not impartial, sir. I love that man. I don't imagine there's a witness alive who knew him well enough to testify honestly about his state of mind who didn't also love him, which I'd think would tell you something about the kind of man he was, rather than something about the reliability of what any of us are telling this court today." It was Judge Dunmore, near the end of the morning, who did the thing that would later be repeated, in one form or another, in every account Ren ever heard of that hearing, from Priscilla, from Odette, from Corrigan himself. He removed his glasses, set them on the bench in front of him, and looked directly at Weston, seated stiff and silent beside his attorney, and asked him a single question in a voice that had gone very quiet and very plain. "Mr. Vale, you are a businessman, and by all accounts a capable one. I have read the psychiatric testimony your counsel has offered, and I have read the medical evaluations offered by the defense, and I find, frankly, that the defense's evidence is considerably more specific and considerably less speculative than your own. So let me ask you directly, man to man, and I'd ask you to set your attorney's strategy aside for just one honest moment in answering it. Do you genuinely believe your father did not understand what he was doing when he signed that amendment? Or do you believe, in your heart, that he understood perfectly well, and that what actually troubles you is not his competence, but his choice?" The courtroom held very still. Weston sat with his hands flat on the table in front of him, and Run, watching from the gallery, saw something move across his face that she had never once seen there in 25 years of knowing him. Not grief exactly, not shame exactly, something closer to the particular exhaustion of a man being asked, finally, by someone with the authority to make the question matter, to stop performing a version of himself he had been performing for so long he had nearly convinced even himself of it. "I believe," Weston said, and his voice, when it came, had none of the boardroom certainty it had carried on the phone in December, "that my father loved her more than he loved me. I believe he had good reasons to. I don't know how to make that not feel like theft." It was not the answer Halloran had prepared him to give. Ren watched the attorney's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly beside his client, and she watched Judge Dunmore nod once, slowly, the nod of a man who has just heard the only fully honest sentence spoken in his courtroom all morning. "That is a very human thing to feel, Mr. Vale," the judge said. "It is not, however, a legal basis for setting aside a properly executed, independently evaluated trust instrument. I am dismissing this contest in its entirety. I want to be plain about my reasoning, so that there is no ambiguity in the record. The evidence before me does not merely fail to establish undue influence. It affirmatively establishes the opposite, a man of sound and unusually clear mind, making a deliberate and well-documented choice, for reasons he took considerable care to explain in his own hand before he died. I am also going to note, for the record, that this action appears to have been filed with full knowledge, on the part of the plaintiff and his counsel, that no reasonable legal theory supported it, and I will be considering, at a separate hearing, whether sanctions are appropriate given the burden this litigation has placed on the defendant during what is, by any measure, still a period of grief for every party in this room. The written order, when it came down 3 weeks later, dismissed the contest entirely and imposed sanctions of $62,000 against Weston personally, payable to Run within 90 days, the court's finding that the action had been pursued without a good faith basis and had caused demonstrable harm, both financial and personal, to the defendant. Weston did not call after the ruling. He did not write. He paid the sanctions through his attorney on the 89th day, by certified check, and for the better part of a year, the only contact between them ran through Priscilla, who visited Halcyon Ridge more and more often as that first spring turned into summer, bringing her own grown children eventually, teaching them, in her own careful, late-blooming way, to look through the eyepiece their grandfather had once let her look through for exactly 10 minutes at a time, decades before, without ever telling her she was welcome to stay longer if she'd only asked. Ren paid off the hospital debt the same month the ruling came down. A single wire transfer that closed out 5 years of monthly statements she had learned to open standing up, so she would not have to sit with the number any longer than necessary. She called the billing office herself to make the payment rather than let Corrigan's office handle it. And the same tired, not unkind woman who had once warned her about collections answered the phone. And there was a long pause on the line after Ren gave the account number. Long enough that Ren wondered if the call had dropped, before the woman said, in a voice gone suddenly unsteady, that in 11 years of working that desk, she had made exactly one other call like this one, and that she hoped, whatever had happened, it meant something good had finally happened to somebody who deserved it. Ren paid off the duplex remaining lease obligations the same week, though she and Milo stayed in it another 8 months out of a stubbornness she did not fully examine, some reluctance to let the last ordinary chapter of their old life end faster than it needed to, before finally moving into a smaller house of their own in the valley below the ridge, close enough to the observatory that Milo could ride his bike up the gravel road on his own by the following summer, close enough that Ren could still, most evenings, see the dark curve of Halcyon Ridge against the sky from her own back porch. The way she imagined Corwin must have seen his own future settling into place, decades before, from a mountain he had built with his hands and had never once told anyone the whole truth about until it was almost too late to tell them at all. It was Milo, in the end, who broke through to Weston, though not on purpose, and not for a long while yet. That came later, in the second year, after Ren had used a portion of the trust to pay off both the hospital debt and the duplex mortgage outright and had, true to the promise in Corwin's last letter, enrolled in an accelerated pre-medical program at the state university 2 hours away, driving down twice a week for coursework while Milo stayed with Odette, who had become, without either of them ever formally deciding it, something very near a grandmother to the boy. It came after Ren had converted the observatory's outbuilding into a proper visitor's center, small and unpretentious, with a hand-lettered sign at the base of the gravel road that read, in careful shaded serifs she had taught herself to letter that first winter, Vale Community Observatory, free stargazing, Saturdays, asked for Ren. A sign Simon had cut the post for and set into the ground the same weekend. Odette brought up a thermos of coffee and sat on the old bench without saying much of anything at all, which Ren had come, by then, to understand as Odette's highest form of approval. The first child to come up the gravel road that spring was a girl of 9, named Callie Renfro, whose family had lost their farm the year before to a bad harvest and worse debt, and who stood 2 steps inside the dome door not knowing where to look, the way every person who had ever stood in that doorway across 50 years had not known where to look, until Ren pulled out the second stool and said, "Sit down. There's Coco. Tell me what you'd like to see tonight." By the second summer there were a dozen children some Saturdays, more in July when school let out and word had traveled far enough down into the valley that families started driving up from Town's Run had never had reason to visit herself. A boy named Desmond Ochoa, named, his mother told Ren with a small embarrassed laugh, after a favorite uncle and not, as Ren had first assumed with a jolt she chose not to explain to anyone, after her own late husband, came every week for an entire summer to learn how to grind his first lens, sitting at the same bench where Simon had once sat at 19, guided now by Simon's own hands instead of Corwin's, though the polishing lap and the patient instructions to listen to the glass instead of watching it had not changed in 50 years and, Ren suspected, would not change in the next 50 either. An older woman named Constance Pruitt, recently widowed, came alone most Saturdays not for the telescope at all, but for the company of the folding chairs Ren kept set up near the stove, and sat there for hours some evenings without ever once asking to look through the eyepiece, and Ren, remembering what Odette had once told her about a room that did not always announce what it was actually for, never once pushed her to. She still gave Milo his letter that spring, on the anniversary of the day she had first opened the trust folder in the chamber, choosing the date carefully, deliberately, the way she imagined Corwin himself might have chosen it. She sat with him in the leather chair at the small cherry desk, the chamber lit now with proper electric light Simon had run down from the dome above, and she watched her son's face as he read his grandfather's handwriting for the first time, slower and more careful with a 12-year-old than it had been with her, explaining constellations and grinding technique, and the particular patience required to trust a piece of glass long before it was ready to show you anything true, and near the end. A paragraph that made Milo look up at his mother with an expression she would carry with her for the rest of her life. "I am leaving your mother the room," Corwin had written, "but I am leaving you something I think may matter more in the long run, which is the knowledge of how she carried you and me both, at the same time, through the hardest years either of us ever lived, without once putting either of us down to rest her arms. Watch her closely as you grow, Milo. Learn to be the kind of man who carries the people he loves the way she carried us, and you will have learned everything this observatory, and everything under its floor, was ever actually built to teach." Weston came up the mountain for the first time in the third year, on a Saturday in October, unannounced, parking his car at the bottom of the gravel road rather than driving all the way up, as though he did not yet trust himself to arrive at the door directly. Ren saw him from the dome, a gray-suited figure climbing the last stretch of road on foot in the thin afternoon light, and she walked out to meet him rather than wait for him to knock, because 5 years of Sunday visits to a difficult, silent man had taught her, if nothing else, that some people needed to be met part way or they would never make the whole distance on their own. He did not apologize, not exactly, not in so many words. He stood at the edge of the gravel turnaround with his hands in his coat pockets and looked up at the dome's weathered copper skin for a long moment before he spoke. "Priscilla says you've got children coming up here on Saturdays now. Free of charge." "Some of them," Ren said. "Most of them, actually." He nodded slowly, and something in his face, older now, less certain of itself than it had been at the well reading 3 years before, worked through whatever he had climbed the mountain to say. "I looked up the girl's name. Callie Renfro, the one Priscilla mentioned. Her family lost their farm the same year I closed 2 of Fenwick's regional offices and let go of 40 employees to protect the shareholders' return. I told myself for 30 years that was just business, the cost of running a company the right way. I don't know when exactly I stopped believing that was the whole truth of it. Maybe I never fully believed it. Maybe I just needed somewhere quieter than a boardroom to admit it out loud." Ren did not say anything right away. She let the silence sit the way Odette had once let silences sit with her, unhurried, unfilled, a courtesy she had learned this mountain taught everyone. Eventually, whether they wanted the lesson or not. "I'm not asking for anything," Weston said finally. "I know I don't have a claim here, legal or otherwise, and I'm not fool enough after that courtroom to pretend I do. I just wanted to see it. Whatever he built up here that made him choose you over his own blood. I think I owe it to him, and maybe to myself, to actually look at it instead of just hearing about it secondhand from a lawyer's invoice." She showed him the dome first, then the ledgers, then, after a long moment of consideration she would not fully be able to explain even to herself, the stairs down into the chamber, though by then most of what had once filled it had already been carefully catalogued, appraised, and in the case of the meteorite collection, partially donated, at Ren's own direction, to the same university lab in Atlanta that had first confirmed the lunar specimen's authenticity, a decision she had made not out of any obligation but because she had read, in the last of Corwin's letters, a line about wanting the collection to teach rather than simply to sit, and had decided, reading it, that a fortune left entirely untouched in a mountain vault was not so very different from a fortune never given at all. Weston stood at the bottom of the stairs for a long time, looking at what remained, the empty crates stacked now against one wall, a handful of instruments still on their rack awaiting proper museum placement, the small cherry desk where his father had written 4 letters to a woman he was not related to by blood, and, as it turned out, 1 more to a boy who was. "He was a bigger man than any of us understood," Weston said finally, and Ren heard, in his voice, an unmistakable echo of something Priscilla had said to her once, in a different kitchen, over a box of watercolors, a family beginning, slowly and imperfectly, to arrive at the same understanding from 3 different directions. "He was the same man he'd always been," Ren said. "We're only just now learning how to read him. He came back the following month, and the month after that, standing a little further inside the door each time, staying a little longer, and by the second spring he had begun, without either of them ever discussing it directly, to help fund a small scholarship through what remained of the Halcyon Ridge Trust, named for his father, awarded each year to a local student pursuing something in the sciences that their own family could not otherwise afford to support, and Ren understood, watching him, signed the first scholarship check at her own kitchen table with a hand that shook slightly more than it once had. That this was Weston's version of the stone staircase, slower than hers had been, less complete, but a descent all the same, into a room he had spent his whole adult life refusing to believe existed. The observatory still opens every Saturday. The wood box in the workshop stays full, though Ren could not always say who fills it, since half the county's older residents seem to have adopted the ridge, in their own unannounced way, as a shared responsibility the way Odette once adopted it alone. The ledgers, 47 of Corwin's and, by the 5th year, 3 of Ren's own, stand together on the same clear pine shelves, and the names in the newer volumes are different from the names in the old ones. But the shape of every entry is exactly the same. A child, a broken instrument, a grief that had nowhere else to go until someone offered it a quiet room and an hour of patient, undivided attention. Milo is 17 now, and spends most Saturday evenings teaching the youngest visitors how to find true north the way his grandfather once taught him, patient in a way that still, sometimes, catches Ren by surprise when she watches him from across the dome. So much of Desmond in the tilt of his head, so much of Corwin in the steadiness of his hands. He has already told his mother, more than once, that he intends to study optical engineering, though he has also told her, in the same breath and with the same seriousness, that he intends to keep every Saturday on this mountain for the rest of his life regardless of where the studying takes him, and Ren, who understands better than almost anyone alive what it costs a person to keep a promise like that across decades, believes him completely. She finished her medical training the spring Milo turned 16, and now splits her week between a small clinic in the valley and the mountain that raised both her children, the one she carried into the world and the one, in its own strange and silent way, that carried her. She still keeps a dented tin cup with a crescent-shaped dent in the rim on the shelf above the dome's little kitchen alcove, though she has never once used it herself, has never quite been able to bring herself to pour cocoa into it, since the last evening Corwin filled it with his own unsteady hand. It sits there instead the way certain objects come to sit in certain families, not as decoration, not quite as relic either, but as a small fixed point around which everything else, grief and money and forgiveness, and all the slow, complicated work of learning to see the people who love us clearly, continues, patiently, to turn. There was a Perseid shower in the 3rd August after the ruling, and Ren woke Milo, 17 by then and taller than his father had ever gotten to be, at midnight, the way Corwin had once woken him at 7, and led him out onto the same flat gravel apron beside the dome with the same wool blanket, worn thinner now but still warm enough, over both their shoulders. Odette came, moving slower up the path than she once had but refusing, as always, any offer of an arm to lean on. Simon came, and Priscilla, driving up after her own children were finally settled for the night 2 counties away, and even Weston, who had taken to spending the occasional weekend on the ridge by then, arrived a little after midnight in the same gray suit he seemed to wear to everything, though he had at least noticed, finally traded the dress shoes for a pair of boots that suggested he intended to actually sit on the ground with the rest of them rather than watch from a folding chair the way he had the first few times. They lay on their backs in a loose, uneven row, 6 of them now where there had once been 3, and counted the meteors out loud the way Corwin used to. And somewhere past 1 in the morning, in a lull between streaks of light, Milo turned his head toward his mother in the dark and asked her, without any of the careful weight a 17-year-old usually gives to a question he has clearly been saving up, whether she thought his grandfather could see any of this from wherever he'd ended up. Ren thought about it for a long moment before she answered, watching the faint smoke trail of a meteor fade against the black. "I think," she said finally, "that your grandfather spent 50 years building rooms so that people who couldn't say what they meant out loud could still find a way to be understood. I don't know what happens to a person after they die, Milo. But I know he built this ridge to outlast him, and I know it's still doing exactly what he built it to do, which might be as close to seeing as anyone gets to keep once they're gone." Weston, a few feet down the blanket, said nothing, but Ren heard him shift slightly in the dark, and when the next meteor streaked overhead a moment later, she heard him count it out loud himself, unprompted, in a voice she had never once heard him use before that night, unguarded, and, for the first time in the whole long, complicated history of this family, entirely without an audience to perform for. Light is patient, Corwin used to tell Milo. On the nights the boy grew frustrated waiting for a faint object to resolve in the eyepiece, refusing to hurry itself along for anyone's convenience, arriving exactly when it arrives, and not one moment sooner. It took a family the better part of 3 years to understand that the man who taught them that lesson about the sky had also, without ever once saying so directly, been trying to teach it to them about each other the whole time. And if you drive up Halcyon Ridge on a clear Saturday evening now, past the small hand-lettered sign at the base of the road, you will find a dome full of children looking up. A woman who was once told her father-in-law's whole estate amounted to $1 now, teaching them what she was taught, and somewhere above all of it, older light than any of them will ever fully understand, still arriving, unhurried, exactly on time. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.